Hey everyone, so I am so excited to be back shooting videos again. Obviously, I've got a new member of the family and I'm really excited to be able to make videos even though he's a couple months old. And so this is one of the only ways I can do it while my wife makes dinner. But this video isn't about that. I'll have more videos coming about, family updates and gear updates because I have new gear. I don't know if you'll be able to guess, but we have autofocus, so that is the only hint that you're gonna get. In the meantime, we're gonna be going over picture profiles, custom setting styles, how to shoot in slow motion on the Panasonic G85, and lastly, I'm gonna share some extra tips because this is a reboot video from 2 years ago, so I'm gonna be sharing a little bit extra that I didn't share in that past video. Also, if you wanna skip this entire video, in the description, I'm gonna be having a free downloadable PDF. You'll actually get a one-page printout of all of these settings and where to find them. So if you prefer having a sheet of paper in front of you and just doing your settings there, feel free to go in the description and download that little one-page PDF guide. So when it comes to picture profiles, there's a lot of debate between natural and standard. A lot of people say standard has slightly better skin tones, whereas natural saves a little bit more of the highlights and shadows, basically a little more dynamic range. So for me, I've had really good luck with natural. You get a good balance of dynamic range and good color. For settings, I would really recommend putting all of your picture profile settings at -3 and the saturation at 0. So putting everything at -3 gives what you call a flat image. Now, there are pros and cons to that, but it just gives you the most flexibility in post. Practically speaking, to change that specific setting, move your mode dial to movie mode, navigate to your profiles, and then select natural, and then set all the corresponding settings to -3 and 0. Next up, we're gonna be talking about custom settings dials, and honestly, this is one of the most helpful things in my opinion, having one setting for really beautiful 4K with all of your settings in place and then another setting for your slow motion. So we're gonna set up C1 to shoot in 4K 24p, and we're gonna set up the C2 to shoot in 60 frames per second. Because honestly, there's nothing more annoying than messing with your settings, whether you're out shooting just random stuff, or especially if you're doing client work, you wanna make sure that you're ready and you have all of your settings really stored within the camera so you don't have to be fiddling with things. So first off, you'll have to make sure that your exposure settings are properly set up. In your menus, navigate over to exposure settings and make sure to change the exposure settings from, it'll say A, S, and make sure that's on M for manual. Manual basically means that we get to control the settings instead of the camera. So for those manual settings, you wanna make sure to set your ISO at the lowest setting. In G85's case, it's gonna be at ISO 200. This just gives the cleanest image. You're not gonna get a whole lot of noise in it. It'll actually keep your exposure a little lower, which will become a little more relevant as we talk a little later. But the next one that you're gonna wanna set is your aperture. You also wanna set that as low as possible. It's kind of confusing, but the lower the aperture, the more light that lens is gonna let in. So think of it like the pupil in your eye. So when light hits it, it's going to get smaller. That would mean your aperture is higher. And for instance, if you're in a dark room, your pupil is going to get a lot bigger. Basically means your aperture gets smaller. So it's kind of confusing. The lower the aperture, the more light the camera's gonna be letting in and hitting the sensor. So in my case, I have the 25mm 1.7. I'm gonna be shooting at 1.7. Now, if you have the kit lens, the lowest you're gonna be able to go on that is gonna be 3.5. So next you're gonna wanna set your shutter speed to double your frame rate. We're gonna set frame rates in a second, but for now, since we're gonna be shooting in 4K at 24 frames per second, double of 24 is 48. Actually, this camera I'm shooting on can shoot at 1/48 of a second. That's another hint at what camera this is. But Panasonic does not allow you to do that. So Panasonic can shoot at 1/50th of a second. So go ahead and set your G85 shutter speed to 1/50th. What that essentially does is it gives you motion blur. So you can see that my hand is kind of streaking across the image, and it just makes it so it's not just jaggedy and jittery. And you've probably noticed that on your footage if you've been outdoors shooting in auto, just like, why the heck does it look so staccato jittery? So that's why your shutter speed is way too high. So shoot at 1/50th of a second when you're shooting in 24 frames per second. So under your resolution settings, you're gonna go over and navigate to 4K 24 frames per second. 4K 30 frames per second is gonna give you that kind of home video look. So you're gonna wanna make sure to shoot in 24 frames per second. So at this point, you're gonna need to save all of these settings into the C1 dial. So while you're still in the movie dial, you're gonna go over into settings, go into custom set memory, and you're gonna go navigate to C1, and then you're gonna overwrite all of these settings, which will then, when you navigate your dial over to C1, will save everything you just did into that setting. So now that that's down, we're gonna go make C2 our slow motion. What you're gonna do is you're gonna change your resolution to 1080p at 60 frames per second. If you think about shutter speed being double your frame rate, you wanna make sure to, if you're shooting at 60 frames per second, Panasonic allows us to shoot at 1/125th, which is the closest thing. So set your shutter speed to 1/125th, keep your aperture and ISO at the same lowest levels that you can, and then you're gonna go into custom set memory and you're gonna save it as C2. Overwrite that as well, and that'll make it so now we're pretty much completely set up in our custom settings, our picture profiles, and it just makes things really easy when you wanna go and quickly start shooting. The last couple tips that I've accumulated over these couple years with the G85. One of the extra tips is your white balance. Honestly, exposure and white balance are probably the two things that matter in some ways more to me than even depth of field or the correct shutter speed, because if your exposure is wrong, you can't really do anything with your footage. But if your color is really screwy, or if it's shifting all the time, it just makes editing like a complete nightmare. If you've ever shot an auto white balance and you go from like one room to another, or even a shot like this where I have a warm background glow with more of a cooler, just daylight light, auto white balance would just shift, and then it would just make it really difficult to edit. So if you want to go ahead and take your G85's image to just incrementally the next level, I would shoot in manual white balance. So it's going to take some getting used to. If you want to save it into your custom settings, like put it on a daylight balance, then it'll force you to change it based on the different scenarios. Go ahead and work on your white balancing and then go from there. Now there are two pieces of gear I would add to your arsenal first, other than, you know, audio gear, getting a light. I would actually add a lens, one specific lens, and then one other piece of gear. The first piece of gear I would get is the Panasonic 25mm f1.7. And like I said before, the 1.7 gives you really nice depth of field, but it also lets in a lot more light. So you're gonna be able to get better low light with that lens, and you're gonna get really nice depth of field, that blurry background that everybody seems to be obsessed about. That lens is amazing. And then I would also recommend picking up a variable ND filter. I personally use Gobe ND filters. They're cheap. They seem to be decently sharp. They don't mess with the color a whole lot. And for me, they've been working really, really well. So those are 40 to 70 bucks, depending on the size of thread that you get. What those enable you to do is imagine like there's sunglasses for your camera, because when you set up the C1 or C2 outdoors, you're gonna notice everything is completely white because it's way too bright. So what the ND filter does is it enables you to take your image and darken it so that you get the proper exposure, so that you don't lose all of that information to highlights clipping. And so I would highly recommend it, especially if you're shooting outside a whole lot. Get an ND filter, get a slightly better lens, and you will be amazed at the upgrade. So anyways, it's really good to be back shooting videos again, editing. I decided to kick things off with like one of the more complicated and time-consuming videos, but I figured it was about time to reboot this one and add a few tidbits at the end. Obviously I'm pretty tired right now, so I hope it wasn't too rambly, but I really hope that the Panasonic G85 continues to serve you well. It has served me super well, and I'm looking forward to doing more content on this camera and the camera that seems to have pretty great autofocus. So anyways, I look forward to continuing to make more videos, and we'll see you all in the next one.